Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our quantitative history webinar. So today, with great pleasure, our speaker is Professor Felipe Valencia from Vancouver School of Economics and the UBC. Felipe is a rising star in economic history. His study covers a broader context ranging from America in Spain and also in Southeast Asia. Today, Felipe will talk about his new and fascinating study with his co-author Juan Felipe Riano in terms of the long-term impact of the conflicts and wars in Laos. After the 1-hour presentation of Felipe, we will be happy to invite Professor Koken Du from Northwestern University as our discussant. He will discuss for about 15 minutes. And finally, we will leave some time to our audience for Q&A. So now, welcome, Professor Felipe.
Thank you very much, Chi Cheng. Let me try to share my slides here. Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah, good.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Chi Cheng, for the introduction, and Shiwu for the invitation as well, and QA for agreeing to discuss this paper. I think it's essentially the best discussion we could hope for. Let me also say that my co-author, Juan Felipe Riano, who's a graduating PhD student here from UBC at the VSE, is also in the chat and would be happy to help me out with questions. He'll be going to Stanford for 1 year and then joining the economics department at the Georgetown University. And of course, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. We're going to be talking about the legacy of the quote-unquote secret war in Laos. So let me just jump right into the economic motivation of this talk. And the question is actually fairly simple. We study here the long-term impact of conflict. And of course, I mean, I guess conflict is very present in our minds in recent times due to the Ukraine-Russian war. And we have, I think, good evidence of what happens kind of in the short term after conflict. Of course, there is the ongoing devastation as the one that we are seeing in the news today, but we also know more or less what happens kind of in the short term. There's a very nice seminal work by people like Ted Miguel, Bladman, etc. Also Collier, more on the policy side, looking at what happens after conflict. But I'm an economic historian, and when you take the longer term view of things, it's a bit less clear what happens. So I would kind of like summarize the consensus the following way. If you look at post-conflict societies such as Japan and Germany, so the bombing of Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, especially the famous paper in the AR by Davis and Weinstein, or this paper in the Journal of Economic Geography for Germany, there's really not much of a long-term negative impact in these kind of like strategic bombings. And I guess the closest case, and I'm sure QA would have a lot to talk about this context as well, would be a famous paper for Vietnam by Ted Miguel and Gerard Roland, saying that, yes, there was widespread devastation during the conflict, but there's essentially no long-term impact of bombing. If you take even the longer sweep of history and you is kind of thinking what Charles Tilly, the famous historian, wrote about, there might even be a positive potential effect, because if you think about conflict and state capacity, there's kind of this idea that states made war and war made states. And so maybe through this fiscal capacity mechanism, actually war was one of the things that helped Europe grow. If you think, for instance, the classic work of Nico Voigtlander and Joachim Voth, and there could even be a Malthusian mechanism, like you have less people, so you have higher wages, etc., etc. I think in this paper, we are trying to talk to this old question with new data, with new econometric identification techniques. And I think we're joining kind of like a new set of papers that are looking either at similar contexts, for instance, the paper by Melissa and Pablo about Vietnam as well, a paper by Manicini, Fontana, and Tabellini on the Italian Civil War. I have other work on the Spanish Civil War. My co-author has work on Colombia, and I have other work on Paraguay. So this is kind of like a broader agenda of looking at conflict in the long term. So in this paper, we are focusing on Laos, technically the Lao People's Democratic Republic. You might know that is actually one of the poorest countries in the region. 24% are poor, 80% live under $2.5 a day, mostly subsistence agriculture. But you might also know or not know, this is the most heavily bombed country in human history on a per capita basis. And this was, I mean, I'm going to give you a little bit more context, but due to the US bombing operations, it's calculated that from 1964 to 1973, it received one bomb every 8 minutes. So just to give you a context, much more than the whole bombing campaigns during World War II. So this is a massive bombing campaign. So what we try to ask here is just, could the underdevelopment of this very poor country potentially be caused or related to this extreme bombing campaign? And if so, I guess it's more like not only persistence, but like through which type of mechanisms. What we're emphasizing here is the special role of UXO, Unexploded Ordnance, which might have a persistent effect. So the idea here is that there's bombs that actually explode, many don't, and then even though the conflict is over, you still have this bomb that, or this mine, that could potentially hamper your health in the most obvious ways, but also shift different types of economic investments, such as human capital, broadly understood, health and education. It could change settlement patterns. So we're going to see some results that are more on the urban side of things. If there's time, I also want to show you a little bit of migration results that we find that are quite interesting. So at the end of the day, it's more this mechanism through UXOs that is going to hamper economic important and relevant activities, such as structural transformation. And there's a little bit of evidence of that already. For instance, a very nice paper on demining campaigns in Mozambique that you see there. There's work also in Colombia that has an ongoing demining campaign, and a very nice paper for Cambodia that kind of speaks to a similar mechanism. And of course, Cambodia, I guess you can see it maybe here in the map. So we have Laos and we have Cambodia and neighboring Laos, and obviously Vietnam on the right hand side of that. So let me give you, it's at the end of the day, a history paper. So a little bit of the historical background, that is just one slide. And I'm probably not gonna play too much with the videos today, but it can be understood in the context of the classic Cold War confrontation between the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc. There is the communist Pathet Lao and the royal Lao government. And what the US does, and this is actually quite important also in the history of the CIA, is the birth of the military CIA. So it's the classic US counterinsurgency operation. There's a series of specific campaigns, such as Operation Menu, Steel Tiger, Tiger Hound, and Commando Hunt. We're going to see in a second, actually, these were largely unknown in the US. Of course, they were not unknown in Laos. I mean, Laotians were seeing these bombs on a daily basis, as I mentioned before. It can be understood as a geostrategic game in the region with the Cambodian Civil War, which is almost contemporaneous, 67 to 1975. Again, I mentioned the Aaron Lin's paper on this, eventually the Khmer Rouge, which are supported by Northern Vietnam, and the Kingdom of Cambodia. And so essentially, again, like kind of like display of the Khmer Republic versus the Khmer Rouge. essentially the capitalist and the communist bloc. And obviously the elephant in the room, the Vietnam War starts in 55 until 75. So this is part of this broader confrontation in Southeast Asia, the Indochina Peninsula of North Vietnam versus South Vietnam. And within that broader confrontation, there's these secret bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia. An estimate of around 1.6 million recorded missions, flights, with 13 million bombs. And I guess the essence of the paper is summarized by that Laotian proverb that you see there. When buffaloes fight, so here it would be kind of like the big superpowers, it is the grass that suffers, essentially Laos in this case. So on Laos, President Obama was the first US president to visit the country, September 6, 2016. Has a pretty amazing speech. Here we're just quoting a few lines of that. So he says, look, I mean, it's crazy. Like, I'm the first president to be here. 6 decades ago, this country fell into civil war. And as the fighting raged next door in Vietnam, as we were just talking about, your neighbors and foreign powers, including the US, intervened here. And as a result of that, like bad things happened, and the US didn't acknowledge the war. It was a secret war. And for years, the American people did not know. Even now, I would claim as well, we would claim as well, many Americans are not fully aware about the Laotian quote unquote secret war. Over 9 years, from 64 to 73, the US dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs in Laos, more than what was dropped in Germany and Japan combined during all of World War II. It made Laos per person the most heavily bombed country in history. As one Laotian said, the bombs fell like rain. So I think that just encapsulates the background that we are going to study in this paper. In a nutshell, what are we doing? So, and of course, we're going to go through all of the econometric hoops, but essentially we're going to combine a measure of income. In this case, I'm showing you stable lights, but we're going to also test that. At different points in time. Here, I'm just going to show you 1 year, 2013, with very detailed bombing events. Here, I mean, I told you before, like there are millions of observations in this graph, and we have like the geo-coded location of each of these bombs. And we're just going to ask this very simple question, of course, only aided by the arrow of time here and no identification whatsoever, which is, are places that are more lit or less lit at night today, in 2013, in modern times, how do they correlate with these US bombing events in history? So here you can see kind of like the relationship in Laos. It's very simple. More bombs, less lights, less bombs, more lights. Okay, and the rest of the paper is going to be the due diligence of, is this causal? What are the mechanisms of transmission? What are the potential confounders, et cetera, et cetera. But just to give you a sense, this would be kind of like the preview of the results. Is just done in a visual way today. So what are the more serious econometrics that I guess you sign up for today? And we're going to use a grid cell level analysis. I'm going to illustrate that in a second. So these are very small, and they allow us to go even smaller than the region or province, but even kind of like smaller than the districts in Laos. So let me just jump one slide and show you that. So these are our grids. Then these are the different provinces in Laos. And then there's the smaller districts, more than 100. I'm going to show you the number of observations in a few slides. And we're going to see, again, just remember that other graph that you saw, just how lit are these pixels at night. And we can accumulate that during different years or just use 1 year, and how many bombs they received. And I guess just a visual inspection of this, as we did before, is going to tell you there's some areas that are heavily bombed and that are less lit at night today. And you can also see that here in the north, so the plain of jars nowadays. So that's the type of analysis that we're going to have for most of the paper. It's going to allow us to run a pooled OLS version and more importantly, a fixed effect version, so that it's really kind of like very within district, within state type of analysis. Of course, that's not going to be enough for identification, because there could still be things that, even though are very disaggregated, are still endogenous. Like, again, Laotians are saying bombs fall from the sky, but I mean, there are costs about bombing, and obviously in this case, Americans are bombing strategic targets, and that's all endogenous. So we're going to use an IV, instrumental variables approach, that exploits in a way the informational symmetries of war. So in this case, we're actually going to have two instruments, and we can discuss about the validity, and I'm sure QA has some thoughts about that as well. And that's going to be the second strategy. And at the end, we're going to zoom more into like the highest degree of disaggregation that we can, which is a person, in this case, an individual. And we're going to do a diff in diff. So we're going to just not only exploit kind of like the spatial dimension of the data, but also this time variation. So was my cohort affected or not? If I happen to live in this province or in this district that was bombed at a certain age, when I was a kid or when I was an adult. Our data is going to come from, so the bombing side, the conflict side, is going to come from the US Department of State. This is recently declassified information, highly detailed, geolocated, and again on 16 million bombs. Nightlights, the usual source from the US, from the other US Air Force Defense and Meteorological Survey, 1993, 2003, and 2013, to get a sense of time there. And then we're going to use not only kind of like this grid cell approach, but also the census approach here, using the 2005 and the 2011 census at the village level. And then at the end, we're going to go to the individual level data. Okay, and I'm going to kind of like walk you through the different types of analysis, and to look at the specific mechanism of transmission, which is UXO contamination. We actually have a daily panel on UXO accidents that starts in the 1950s up until essentially modern times. And we're going to also show you kind of like what are the potential effects of bombing on UXO over time. So that's kind of like the core or of the data set, and kind of the outline of the empirical strategy that we're going to follow today. Okay, this, just to remind you, it's kind of like the level of disaggregation that we're having here. And again, it's a lot of observations that we're going to see in a second in the tables. So what is it that we're running exactly? We're going to use different specifications, but the main one is at the beginning is going to be a cross section of luminosity. Okay, and there are different ways to measure this, and we show robustness in the paper on total bombs. And this is going to be, again, different ways to measure this, like the 1 plus the log or the inverse sine, etc., etc. So just essentially bombs on luminosity with a vector of geographic and location controls that I'm going to show you in a minute. So yes, it matters if you're close to some geographic I don't know, a river, a mountain, etc. And yes, it might matter like some other conditions that are a bit closer to the actual war. So we're going to see some of them in a second in the tables. And on top of that, we're going to be able to take fixed effects. So in this case, we're going to have a fixed effect at the spatial dimension. So at the state level or district level or the province level. And once we have the pooled analog of these, so we're aggregating over time, we can also have time fixed effects. And I'm gonna again show you kind of like the structure of all these in a minute. Okay, so I think this is just kind of easier to see, and just to show you the actual regression and kind of like go through the structure once, and then it's gonna be very similar for the other tables. So we have total bombs in the past. Okay, we have more than 2,000 observations, which are grids. And then it's just the same negative correlation we saw before. Again, I'm stressing the word correlation because there's no identification here. So more bombs in the past, less luminosity today. But you might be worried that there's some geographic observables and characteristics, altitude, ruggedness, temperature, precipitation, that could be affecting luminosity today, or that could in a way affect bombing. So we're like netting those out in the second column. And then other characteristics that are a little bit more relevant to the conflict itself. So the actual location, latitude and longitude, the distance to the 17th parallel, which is crucial for the Vietnam confrontation, the distance to the Vietnam border itself, the distance to the closest capital, et cetera, et cetera. So just other correlates that are a bit, I mean, they're still geographic, but they're a bit closer in spirit to what we're doing here. Let me just minimize the video panel here. Okay, so that we can do in 1993, which is the closest data that we can get to from the bombing side. We can do it in more modern times in 2003, and we can do it in even more modern times in 2013. And by and large, you see a negative relationship, not effect. Again, I'm not going to use any causal language yet, between total bombs in the past and luminosity today. This is for the level. So this is kind of like a level result. But we might also think about growth, right? Like, I mean, kind of as the literature in the post-war recovery. I'll show you why is this going back. Sorry about that. It's just, I think if there is a question, it goes back. Okay, so growth. Okay, so these areas are not growing more or doing that at slower rates. So growth here is literally a calculation that we do because there's no GDP per capita at this level of disaggregation. And we take the different differences. So it's redundant, but it's true, which is 1993, 2003, 2003 to 2013, or the longer difference, which is 1993 to 2013. And by and large, even though the literature emphasizes and stresses this post-war recovery, we do not find that. So it's not like these areas are booming in terms of growth. And if anything, they're not growing, and in some cases, it's significant, the result. So we take this as there's no growth in these areas, and as we saw before, these areas are indeed less lit at night, which is kind of like the levels result. Then we can, as you saw, kind of like the data structure. So we can do this for the different waves. So 1993, 2003, and 2013. And we can, yes, keep the geographic and location controls, but what the grid cell allows us is to go within the provinces and even within the districts. So kind of, if you remember the map from the beginning where you saw the grids. So now we're gonna have 18 provinces. So we are gonna take these province fixed effect. So whatever you see here is within a province, and you could even do it at the district level. So there are 141 districts in Laos. So this is kind of very disaggregated, a very disaggregated result. So even within these provinces and even within these districts, we find a negative, significant, and across the board, fairly stable result. And again, no identification is just a disaggregation point from OLS to fixed effects. And then the last part of that is just take all of the data. That's why like now we have 3 times the number of observations, but it's just because we have a repeated cross-section in terms of night lights. I just showed you the growth regressions before. And now we can take not only the spatial fixed effects, but also the time fixed effects. So we're gonna take here year fixed effects, and then we're gonna keep this province and district fixed effects, and across the board, it doesn't again matter which specification, we find a negative and significant correlation, which is again fairly stable across the board. And just to kind of like give you a rough sense of magnitudes, maybe you're seeing these numbers and you're asking, okay, is this big, is this small? And just to give you a sense, like based on the famous paper by Storygarden and Weil and Henderson in 2012, we can kind of like more or less using their elasticity translate this coefficient into a significant fall in economic terms in GDP per capita. So these are not only like less lights, but these less lights have a meaningful response in terms of GDP, let me just kind of like quickly show you the calculation. So we just take their data and the results and their elasticities with the betas that we're getting, and that's where we're getting the 9.3% on GDP per capita. Of course, you have to assume that this elasticity is the same for Laos and for other countries. I mean, there's just obviously some assumptions in this type of back of the envelope calculations, but just to give you a sense of the magnitudes here. Okay, so that's all fine and well, but obviously there is a potential identification endogeneity problem, right? So, and this could actually go two ways. So one is, well, maybe it's an underestimate if they're targeting key infrastructure, future development. I mean, it's a war and they're attacking roads, buildings, bridges, etc. So maybe there could be that type of OLS bias, which is gonna end up being the case. Or it could actually be the opposite. If you're targeting very poor and isolated places, and these places were already poor, they're in the middle of the jungle. So, okay, now they're poor, but they're poor because they were poor before, okay? And there are different things that we can do even before getting into like the nitty gritty of the identification strategy, which is, okay, why don't we just trim outliers? So we just take out the very rich places, which could be the urban centers or the capital, Phnom Penh, Vientiane, sorry. Or we can take out the very poor places, in this case, the middle of the jungle, so we can like kind of like just get at the mean or at the median. Or we can just literally run the quantile regression. So the quantile regressions are going to tell us more or less where is the effect, and we find that that effect is more or less working at the not at the very low end of the distribution, but if anything, out of like the at the 0.8 of the distribution. So these are not really like the poorest of the poor areas. This is really like 70-80%. We can think about spillovers. I'm not gonna click on all the buttons for once they're kind of working today, so I don't want to like jinx that. But we can think about spillovers. So is it that I was bombed, or is it that my neighbors were bombed? And actually, it's more that I was bombed more than my neighbors being bombed. We can think about rural urban splits. We can think about existing kind of like the pre-population density. So I'll just show you, I guess that's an important control. So just net of wherever people were in 1960, we still kind of like find the same result. Okay, so this would be kind of like a measure of the pre, which would be important even beyond identification. And you can do these with Conley standard errors that have been suggested in the literature with different transformations of the dependent variable. We'll show you the log as the main baseline, but there's others that we show as robustness in the paper. So I'm not going to bore you too much with that, but just kind of like to get at the point that potentially it's going to be an underestimate what we're seeing in the OLS. So how did we actually try to estimate the effect on the spatial part of the paper? We exploit this idea intuitively about the asymmetries that are typical in conflict, even in the one that we're living today. So some side knows a bit more of their side than the other, and that's, I mean, it's typical of conflict. So one is going to be the proximity to US air bases, and these are based on the classified documents, and that would be like for the communist side. And here it's going to be like these, like people that are being attacked don't know the full capitalist, if you want to call it in those terms, strategy. So these are going to be the bases that are closest to Laos, but that are outside Laos. So these are bases in South Vietnam, in Thailand, and in Japan. And on top of that, they're established before the war starts. So this cannot be like the endogenous construction of bases after the war. These are bases that are already there. And I'm going to show you a few maps of that to make this more clear in a second. And the other part, and it comes with a little bit of a twist, is the distance to the Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is an important strategic supply route for North Vietnam. And we're going to see in a second like how it also cuts through parts of Laos. The important thing here is that part of it was kind of not known to Americans. And again, I'm going to show you what we mean by that. So we take kind of like the more hidden part of Laos. So it's of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So it's not only the trail per se, but there's kind of like this twist, because of course the path itself could be correlated with other roads, etc., etc. So I'm gonna show you, kind of walk you through these two. This is for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So as you see, there's kind of a part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that it was known and it's close to strategic routes, and some others that were like these hidden tunnels that eventually were discovered and now we know. So here the identification relies more on the hidden part, and what you see more or less is that wherever there was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, there is more of these of these bombs. Let me show you the next picture as well, so that you can kind of like see what we're getting at here. So there's gonna be some supply routes, but you're bombing them. And this is from an interview of one of these pilots. We wanted to blow it all up, so the trucks, the infrastructure, etc., but only you see the road. So you're just gonna start bombing everything. Okay, it's like this scorched earth tactic. And then literally, like this is quoting from this interview, it's like killing, it's like trying to put socks on an octopus. Like we're just like, they don't know exactly where it is, and they're just like carpet bombing the whole thing. Okay, obviously like causing massive destruction. You can even see some of the flight paths here in this more zoomed in map, so you can see kind of like where they're going. In many cases, they're actually leaving Vietnam and they were just continuing and bombing Laos. That's why we call it collateral damage, because there's a lot of the action that is actually more endogenous and more pertaining to Vietnam rather than Laos. And then the second part of the instrument that I was telling you about is these military bases, again, the classified documents by the CIA, of course, like not secret anymore. And so we know, again, bases that are not in Laos. There were some that were in Laos, we're just not taking them in the IV. And then they're near enough to Laos, mostly in Thailand and mostly in southern Vietnam. There's also boats, but these are going to be a bit far out, and where you're going to start bombing these targets. And again, you can see here kind of like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so from these bases, you kind of like would go to bomb Laos. And the interesting thing about these bases is not only that they're not on Laos, but that they're built before the conflict starts in any of the parts in Southeast Asia. Okay, so that's kind of like the context and how we're thinking about it. And let me move more towards the actual econometrics. And here again, I think the visual inspection is easier to explain things. And the first stage is going to be this correlation between total bombs dropped and their instrument. The only small twist is that we're doing it here in a quadratic formulation, because we think it's a bit closer to the actual non-parametric estimates of these. So essentially, you're very close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's bombed a lot. The farther out, it's bombed less. We can also do it linearly. I'm going to show you both. And here again, I think that the non-linearity is interesting. So if you're too close to an airbase, I mean, you don't even like turn on the plane, but there's kind of like a sweet spot for bombing from a given airbase. And then if it's too far out, well, you run out of fuel and you're just too far off base. So again, it kind of like gives us this non-linearity. If you don't like it, we can just keep it linear. But this is kind of like our baseline specification, and it's fairly robust, as you can probably guess and see from this graph. This is how it looks in table format and instrument by instrument. So here we have distance to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, instrument number 1, distance to the closest airbase. Maybe you like one or you like the other. So here we're just kind of like full disclosure and like showing you all of them. And this is gonna be the first stage. This is in this case with the quadratic version, in this case with the quadratic version, which is closer to the one that I just showed you before. And then this is the second stage, which again is just kind of like confirming this message of a negative and significant now impact, because presumably this is more causal on night lights today. Okay, and we replicate the same battery of controls, i.e. the geographic location characteristics, the fixed effects at the province level, at the district level, And of course, the year fixed effects, because here we're just like pulling all of the data as the last table I showed you in the fixed effects specification. And this other table is just mimicking the same structure, okay? And we have two instruments. We can run the usual tests for over identification, et cetera. Here we just combine them. And remember, I showed you the quadratic, but we can also do it in the linear form. And so the linear form would be both instruments in a linear form, and it gives us this estimate. And then both instruments with the quadratic terms, and it gives us this number. So it's a little bit more conservative. We are kind of defending this number. Again, negative and significant, but hopefully now causal as opposed to the OLS and the fixed effects that I was showing you before. This works. I mean, there's a lot of robustness. I'm not going to show you all of them. And this works both in the south and in the north, fairly similar coefficients in the IV. And this, maybe you're worried, oh, but like apparently there's a lot of clustering in this one district. It could be. We can just go data-wise and drop district by district, and this is just going to give you the magnitude of the coefficient. In the worst case, it's minus 0.105. In the least damaging case, minus 0.08, but it's quite centered around the one that we're reporting. Okay, it's just the type of robustness that you can do in this case, because again, remember that this is already working at the very within district, within province level. Okay, so that's in terms of identification. Let me, in the remaining time, do at least two more things. One is, all of the analysis so far is at the grid cell level. And then you might say, oh yeah, but they pick these grid cells. I mean, yes, I mean, you can run many tests of the different grid cells, but you can also use the census data. And there's a little bit of a technical complication here, which is not too bad. And I'm just going to show you the pictures. So this is the boundaries for Laos, and these are the dots where the villages in Laos are. Okay, and you're going to see that actually this is even more disaggregated, because before we were in the 10 by 10 kilometer case of the grid cells, and we had around 2,000 observations. Now we're going to have 10,000 villages. Okay, that's great, even more disaggregation. However, there's no boundaries. As you see here, there are only points. Okay, so we use these Thyssen polygons. Okay, with different names, but essentially Thyssen polygons is, I guess, the most common one, which is from these villages we are creating these artificial boundaries. Okay, and so now there's some discussion of like where there are actually like some village boundaries, etc. I mean, it doesn't really matter because there's very, very small. And so just think like from these points, we need to create some boundaries, and we just use these Thyssen polygons, which is a mathematical solution to this problem. Okay, and what it does is kind of like each point and the nearest surrounding neighbor, but for all points. Okay, so it's very easy if you have one, but if you have a lot, then it's gonna like create these shapes. Okay, it's a bit like what happens with bubbles if you've played with like soap bubbles. Okay, okay, so that. So why do we gain with this? I mean, obviously there's a cost, which is we have to calculate all these things. We have not only the nightlight results, but now we can talk about more development outcomes that are closer to the things we care, which is probably not nightlights, but are people rich or poor? Are they eating? Are they not eating? Not eating? And so those are the types of results that I'm going to show you now. So it's not only, it's beyond luminosity. I mean, of course, luminosity has been correlated with income, and that's why we use it. But now we actually have these nice measures, even more disaggregated. So this is what I'm telling you, that now we're like up above 10,000 observations. And here I'm just showing you kind of like the simplest way to plot this, which is a median split of bombs. Are you above the median bombs or below the median? And above the median is going to be blue, just for reference. So if you have more bombs, you're shifted the whole distribution of expenditure to the left. Same thing for consumption, and you're just poorer. Okay, so more bombs, poorer today. Less bombs, you're a little bit less poor today. Okay, so that's what we gain with this type of information. And the other really interesting part is that now we can, from the agricultural census, also look at our main channel of transmission, which is UXO contamination. So there's literally a question in the census, which, I mean, this is endogenous. I mean, if the census, if the national census asks about, is there a UXO problem in your village, that in itself tells you something. Yeah. Now I'm in Canada, like they don't ask that question in the Canadian census. Okay, that I'm aware of. I mean, I haven't filled out the last one, but I'm clearly not. Okay, so this is actually a result. It looks like a line, but it's actually a result, which is bombs on UXO contamination. So it's literally a line. And again, this is not a fabrication of the data. Like, this is an actual result. So it's massively correlated. So you have many bombs, and you have a lot in the extensive margin in terms of agricultural land that is affected by UXO in the agricultural census. Same thing at the intensive margin. So bombs above the median, more intense contamination of UXOs. Bombs below the median, less intense contamination of UXO. Okay, and that's what you get from the census. We can go, because it's the main mechanism of transmission, and just so that you get a sense, I hope these buttons work. And this is kind of an idea of how this UXO looks. Okay, and this is kind of the problem, right? Like, there's bombs literally in the middle of the road. Okay, so you avoid this, so obviously you don't have great roads, but imagine having that in your rice field. Okay, obviously it's going to affect cultivation. Like, this poor person is standing right next to it. I mean, obviously you need to be extremely careful, and this would blow up and either kill you or maim you. Okay, so this is really bad, and that's what we document with this daily panel. So it's not only like this agricultural census, but we have a nice daily panel data starting in the 1950s, that we can use also to test this hypothesis. So how many of these UXO accidents, and mostly these are affecting civilians, and again, remember, this is the end of the war, and there's no more bombing campaigns, but now people start walking around. Okay, so this has killed many people, especially and sadly children. Okay, and what you see here is, I mean, of course, this is daily, so we need to aggregate somehow. Here we aggregate by decade, and in a way, the 1950s is just kind of like no pre-trends. I mean, there's no bombs and there's no UXO event, so it's not a surprise that this is zero. We can just not show it if you don't like it. But starting in the 1960s and the 1970s, areas that were more bombed, and here you can see the heat map for that, and again, it correlates very highly with what I showed you before, right? Like bombs and UXO contamination, but now this is an extra panel that covers the whole country. And there's a positive line. There's a relationship between more bombs and more UXO events. It decays a little bit over time. This is already the 70s, and it decays more and more. But you can see that even in modern times, even in the 2000s, we still find this relationship, that areas that received more bombs historically are also reporting more UXO events today, meaning accidents where you can die, accidents where you can lose a limb, accidents where children that go play can actually, unfortunately, get a disability for life. And that's exactly what we see in this. So now I'm back to the census, now more in the health part. So this is exactly what we see in terms of disability. So bombs above the median, there's a long tail of people that have more disabilities than below the median, which is kind of obvious once you see this. I mean, the health is gonna be directly affected here. But I think what is a little bit less obvious, or what we thought with Juan Felipe, is there are other things that are also affected. So it's not only health, which is the most direct, but it's also human capital broadly understood. So bombs above the median, these kids, these people in general have lower levels of literacy. Bombs below the median, higher literacy. So here's where it becomes more like less obvious and more economics and more externalities, if you want to think about it that way. So there are these bombs, and yes, they're gonna, I mean, the idea is that they killed people like back then, I guess. and then the war is over. They keep killing people, unfortunately, but it's not only through the health side, it's also through the human capital side that we're seeing these effects. It's also there in terms of agglomeration. So these areas are less densely populated today. So again, above the median, less densely populated; below the median, more densely populated. Okay, so you get the picture with the census. Motivated by this, and this is going to be kind of like the final piece of the puzzle in the remaining 10 minutes or so, and we're going to zoom in and look at individual level data. So far we are at the village level. There are 10,000 villages. I mean, that's a lot of observations, but there's a lot more people, around 5 million living in Laos. So why don't we just actually go and see what's happening with these people? So we use the micro data from the 2005 census. This is going to give us a 10% sample, which is quite large. In the US, usually the typical one, you use 1%, 5%. So 10 is actually large. And we have more than 500,000 observations here. So now the outcomes are going to be at the individual level. And what we're exploiting is cohort identification. So do you happen to live in a place, in a province, for instance, that was bombed during a particular time period? And could that have some impact here in the EAK on, let's say, your education or your later life employment status? Okay. And again, we're going to use kind of like the cohort fixed effect, kind of like this temporal thing that's going to be common for everyone, but also some province fixed effect. So it's literally a diff in div. So the indicator variable is just like turning on if I happen to live in this province that was bombed in this particular time period. Okay. And then the very last thing that we're going to do is also to control for migration. And if there's time, which there should be, I'm also going to show you some interesting migration results. Okay. So how does this work, or how does this look? I think it's, again, simplest in pictures. So this is human capital accumulation, and this is for kids or for the generation in 1964. So we see this very substantial. Here is the yearly version. In the paper, we also report the quinquennial measure. I mean, it's essentially the same, but I think that it's interesting that it works even at the yearly level. So you see this big dip. So if you were a kid at the time of the bombing and very soon after, you are receiving less education. Does it recover? Yes. I mean, eventually it recovers, but I mean, here it's like plus 35 years here. Okay. So there is an important dip in human capital accumulation, which is very much consistent with the literacy results that I showed you before. So that's when you were potentially a kid. Obviously, if you're like 40 plus, well, you're not affected because you're not in school anymore. Okay. So this is kind of like, think about the children generation in 64 when the bombing starts. And again, the bombing takes 10 years. So that's why, like, maybe you see like this lag here up until like 10 years. Okay. And then, but we can track these people because now we have the individual level stuff. So it's more like of a cohort analysis. So you were a kid back then, what was your schooling? But now you're a working adult today. How are you doing? So the first thing that we note on the more labor side of things is actually the likelihood of you now at prime working age of being employed is a little bit lower. Okay, so it's kind of like this link between human capital acquisition and eventual labor outcomes, and you again see this significant dip. Okay, so you're less likely of being employed. But we think what is even more interesting is, okay, maybe you have a slightly lower likelihood, but conditional on being employed. So now this is the extensive margin. Now let me show you the intensive margin. Conditional on being employed, where are you working? And where you are working is, and again, in modern times, so age in 2005, you are more in agriculture, significantly so, okay? And less in services. Manufacturing is flat. I mean, I can show it, I guess. So it's just flat, okay? So the action is really agriculture and services, okay? So this dip in human capital when you were a kid seems to eventually later on in life at the individual level make you stay more in agriculture and don't go into manufacturing or into services, i.e., it's delaying at the individual level, but you can think of this at the aggregate level too, the structural transformation of the country. So why is Laos poorer? Well, in part because of these bombs, fine, but what is it doing? Well, in part is because of this UXO problem. Okay, fine, but what is it really doing? Well, it's affecting the human capital accumulation when you're a kid, so that eventually when you're an adult, it's delaying structural transformation once you aggregate up for the whole country. That's why we think that conflict is making Laos, even today, a poorer nation from a conflict that is long gone. Okay. The very last thing that I wanted to show you, so remember there was that X and I said, oh, that's migration, is, well, but what about migration? Because, I mean, people move, okay? It's kind of the usual criticism to any persistence paper, and I guess to any paper that looks at these outcomes over time. It doesn't need to be persistence. And so there is a lower probability of moving. So you might say, oh, I was bombed, I'm just gonna go elsewhere. Well, yeah, but you were bombed, so maybe the infrastructure is not that great. So actually it's the opposite, like you're stuck there. Like you're stuck in this village that is full of bombs, even though the conflict is over. So lower probability of migration, again, just kind of like a step one, step zero check. And we think that what's really interesting is how all of these things that I have been showing you, with the individual level data play out when you combine them. And that's the following. Just a reminder of the pooled. So this is human capital effect. Remember, we had that dip when the kid is still in school in 64, but it's concentrated on non-migrants, those that stayed, more than migrants that are able to leave this cycle. So if you think that conflict is this trap, as people like Collier say, that conflict is this trap, is a poverty trap, and then you're kind of like stuck there, maybe in a, I guess, potentially very depressing paper, one way out is to migrate. And of course, migration is endogenous. I mean, we know that. That's why like this is a heterogeneous effect. So again, the effect is concentrated on the non-migrants rather than the migrants. So migration seems to be one potential way out of conflict. Okay. And of course, there's like a whole interesting interaction between migration, which is a whole topic, and conflict, and this is what we try to do here. And of course, let me just show you kind of like the follow-up of that, which are the structural change results, which are the same. So just to remind you, there's a pooled part. There is this guy, okay, it's just like non-migrants and migrants, no need for fancy notation here. And it's really concentrated on the non-migrants instead of on the migrants, okay, as you can see here. So if you migrate, actually, it's not like you're more in agriculture, maybe slightly less, but I mean, these are essentially zeros. But if you don't migrate, as here, so you got less human capital, you are more in agriculture. Manufacturing is flat, as you can imagine. It's just the composition of a flat line is two flat lines. But the triple interaction with services, it's again the same. So you see that there's the pooled version, so you're less in services, but that's especially true for the stayers. Okay, these actually, I didn't show you too much statistics of that, but it's 10% of the sample that we have, and it correlates well with the statistics that we have for Laos. So those 10% that are moving are not stuck in that equilibrium, and these 90% that remain are less in services and presumably also more in rural areas. Okay, so that's kind of like how everything comes together. And I have 3 minutes and I have 2 more slides. One, so I'm done in a way, so I can just jump to the conclusion slide, which is this one. But let me go back to where we started and discuss 1 or 2 minutes of external validity, because that's probably something that's going to come up in the discussion. So some thoughts on that. Okay, so this is terrible for Laos. What happened? How does it compare with other countries? Okay, and I guess the closest here, I mean, for Cambodia is quite similar. Like I mentioned the paper by Erin Lin. But for Vietnam, it seems to be different, okay? Is it because of the degree of disaggregation? So the most classic paper of this would be Miguel and Roland. Some people in the conflict literature say, actually, maybe disaggregation is better, and there's recent publications on that. Miguel and Roland used 584 districts. They cannot have more because that's the number of Vietnamese districts. Remember, we have around 170 in Laos. We are using grid cell level observations, a lot more villages and a lot more individuals, obviously by definition, but we can aggregate up. So we can just kind of like try to go at the Miguel and Roland level, and that's what you see here, again, a negative and significant line, okay, for the different years. So we can aggregate up, I mean, and get the same result, the negative result. Or it could be different outcomes. We're using night lights. Maybe we should use more development measures, consumption, expenditure, poverty, population density. That's what I showed you during the longer presentation today. So they don't change if you use these other alternative measures. What about investments? So we are siding more with this story of like, well, it's public goods. I'm not going to show you all the buttons in the interest of times, but it could be schools, it could be electricity, it could be water. So what you invest in matters, and clearly the investments were different in Laos than in Vietnam. In the case of Laos, I mean, I guess after all this talk, it's just very obvious. Oh, demine. I mean, why don't you demine the country? 1% of the mines have been demined in Laos, so it's a bit different from the context of Mozambique, where this is not the case, and where they're saying like, oh, it would be great if you can demine, and that's going to have increasing returns to scale. It hasn't happened in Laos. I guess the obvious policy prescription here would be to demine. Just in terms of like magnitudes, what has been spent on demining in Laos in total is exactly what was spent bombing Laos for 1 week. Okay, remember one bomb every 8 minutes. That's 1 week on bombing, and that's what has been invested in Laos in demining. Okay, obviously, I mean, QA is gonna probably talk about this and a lot more, and I don't know, there could be other alternative stories, institutions, etc. So I'm looking forward to that discussion, but just kind of like to start on that topic, and then we just conclude in the interest of time. We use new and highly disaggregated data and where we document a negative and long-term relationship first between historical conflict and modern economic outcomes, but potentially also causal, as it's robust to IV estimation. We think that it's important because it's not only lights, but actually development outcomes that we care about, such as poverty and expenditure. And we stress a particular mechanism in the literature that has been more or less explored in other contexts, which is UXO contamination. So this is one important channel through which war can have a continued effect even after the official ceasefire. And why is that the case? Well, because there's a lot of economic things going on. So there's the immediate health shock, but it's affecting population density, migration patterns, as I showed you at the end, but crucially, human capital accumulation. So you're going to have less education, more disability, and eventually that's going to alter your employment outcomes where you're an adult in prime age. So less employment and conditional being employed, it's going to slow down structural transformation so that you're stuck in agriculture and you're not moving towards manufacturing and services. And the last thing is that extra thing that I showed you, which are these interesting effects or heterogeneous effects, because there's no identification there, it's just the interaction with migration. In the sense that most of the things that we're showing you here are concentrated on non-migrants, i.e. 90% of the sample, instead of the few lucky 10% that were able to move to other areas that perhaps were less affected by conflict. Okay, so I think we're exactly on time, 1 hour, and let me just stop sharing so that QA can move with the discussion. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking to your comments and questions.
Okay, many thanks, Felipe, for the wonderful talk. Well, before we turn to the discussion session, let me remind our audience, please leave your question or comments in our Q&A box. We will respond to your question shortly. So now let's welcome Professor Q. Du from Northwestern University. Professor Du is an expert in this field. So Professor Du, you can share your screen now.
Thank you. So let me share my screen, my slides. I've already put it on. Okay, here we go. So thank you very much. Thank you all for the organization of this workshop and for inviting me to discuss this really excellent paper, and it kind of be closer to my personal and academic interests. So it's really such a wonderful experience to discuss it. And so, well, Felipe has done an excellent job in exposing really key details and also the big picture of the paper. So I'll try to not spend too much time sort of repeating what he has already shown, and instead presenting a little bit my own view of the paper, and also sort of opening up a bit of questions and comments for for the subsequent discussion. Okay, so the paper, well, Felipe made it very clear that this is about the conflict trap, and this is the second link in the conflict trap, which is really important, which is, whether we get poverty or perpetuating poverty out of conflicts. And with this big framework, the question, the detailed question here is really important. So that's about the existence and the magnitude of the long-term impacts of unexploded bombs in Laos, right? So this is also very specific about unexploded and bombs. So bombs that were dropped from the sky and not mines, they're left underground. And with this, so naturally we think of Laos as an underdeveloped country. Well, recently Laos has been growing really fast, but still underdeveloped. But by looking at the very disaggregated and granular level, we're sort of bypassing. So Felipe and Juan can bypass the bigger issues with China, which is that of institutions. So here we're not talking about communism or the reform from communism at all. Instead, we're really talking about an aspect that we can quantify it really well based on cross-sectional variation and a bit more variation that is very intelligently exploited in the paper. So I think this is a really interesting and really important approach for a really important question. And this relates really well to different fields, different areas in economics. So Felipe has talked about the part of economic geography that discusses a lot of those like underlying structures in an economy in terms of geographical distribution of certain aspects, certain underlying resources that help economic activities resume in the long run to the whatever state there was before some really big negative shocks. So we know those papers from the famous paper by Donald Davis for Japan, and the subsequent paper on Germany, both showing that we do see this full resumption of activities, basically. So in a sense, economic geography rules versus like big shocks such as conflicts. And throughout the paper, we also see the close relation with literature on economic growth, especially through the accumulation of human capital and structural transformation. So this paper really speaks to different important aspects of the overall picture that we should have in terms of development and underdevelopment and the distribution of development across space. So in that sense, I think again this is a really important question, a really important topic that that we should consider. And Felipe has spent some time in the end, and I'll spend a bit more time in terms of the comparison between this paper and another one that looks at a similar question in the case of Vietnam that showed no long-run effect of bombing Vietnam. Okay, and so overall, I think this is a really a milestone in the literature of the economics of conflict, or rather the economic development and conflict. And so I would suggest everyone to read the paper carefully, and I hope that the paper will get cited by many future work. Okay, so let me go through some of the details. So by the way, I should have it until 45, right? Or 50. Zhicheng?
Yeah.
So my time is until 10:50, right?
You can feel free. At least 15 minutes, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just afraid that I won't have enough time. Okay, so I just want to stress the relevance of the context of study. So from, many in the US may not, well, Americans may not know where Laos is, but in fact, it's really something that we as economists should care about. So Laos has a population of about exactly Hong Kong's population. It's ranked at the 105th most populated country around the world. So it's around exactly the median country that we should look at in the world. And for instance, it's much larger than Denmark or Norway, countries that economists seem to, for some reasons, care a lot about. So Laos is not insignificant, especially it was part of this huge war, which is what I prefer to call it the second Indochina War. This is how the historians working on this topic tend to call it. Well, to distinguish it, of course, between with the first and the third Indochina War, and it was by far really the hottest war during the Cold War history, right? Well, Felipe has mentioned that the amount of bombs on Laos that exceeded the total amount of American bombs used in the Second World War in Germany and Japan, and then there's plenty of that. Plenty of bombs in Vietnam, plenty of bombs in Cambodia as well. And this is a war that had really deep consequences on American mentality for decades, if you think about it. And it's so I would not really separate the Laotian civil war from the whole Second Indochina War, because it was part of it, and because the big reason behind bombing Laos, well, among other things, fighting the apartheid Laos and all that, but the big reason was really to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Well, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail was really the reason why the communists could sustain their war efforts in South Vietnam, which is the biggest theater of the war, for so long, and had really large long-term economic consequences that historians usually agree on. So it could be the war, it could be communism, and even both of that are part of this big Second Indochina War. There's huge outflows of immigrants, for instance, if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at Canada, if you look at the US, we all know that there are huge Vietnamese and Hmong and Laotian diaspora, and it still remains a big problem, especially Hong Kong, decades after the war. And so obviously there's a lot of policy relevance here, and it should be a central stage that economists should care about. And on top of that, policies are clearly missing. So as Felipe mentioned by the end, the US has spent, on cleaning up the mess in Laos less than the cost of bombing over 10 days, basically. And this was also the moment that the CIA really became militarized. So they also started this idea about heart and minds operation. So we also saw that in another paper of the QJ by Melissa Dell and Paulo Kerubin. But here, you cannot say that it was that successful. So the CIA basically pitched. So they did heart and minds, but more on the part of the royalists and the ethnic Hmong. So the famous general in Laos was Vang Pao, who's of Hmong ethnicity. and they pitched that to, well, against communists. In the end, things didn't work out as well as you may think in terms of the results from Dell and Carabin. And on top of that, since it was really a proxy war, so all of those operations were not scrutinized at all. Like, well, the public in the US couldn't care less, and they didn't know about it because there was no American, like there was no American soldiers in American uniforms on the ground there, and so there's, the public knew very little about it. So again, all that leaves a lot of room for policy relevance. And I think this is, this is time that all those topics should be well considered in the literature of economics of conflict. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the history. Well, again, I'm very fascinated by, and I feel quite personal about this topic. So I've talked a bit about the war, and the picture in the paper. So this picture, I think, captures it perfectly with all the air bases, and the part of Ho Chi Minh Trail that that basically runs throughout the center and southern parts of Laos. Okay, and so we know that, well, it was a really deadly war with, well, a lot of casualties. But what's also important, as Felipe said, is that the unexploded ordnances, so the UXOs, remain long after the war, and most of that is not cleared. So it went on to kill more than 20,000 people. Well, kill or maim more than 20,000 people. So again, there's a really, really sad history. Now, we think of this kind of picture as the typical story of demining and cleaning up the ordinances. But so I have to, coming from what I learned, growing up in Vietnam, the story seems to be quite colorful and, well, quite diverse. And I think I would invite the authors to think a bit more about the mechanisms here a little bit. So this is a picture of a family that trades like scraps of bombs, of shrapnels, and you see like an artillery shell here. So because of those, the massive amount of UXOs, this has also become a trade. There's a business. There's a there's a trade of whatever you can get from bombs, and this trade and this business is extremely dangerous. So this is another picture that kids sell and buy like UXOs between each other. Once they could get, so the metal is valuable, and beyond that, the especially the explosive inside, if they could get it out safely, it's very valuable. So they could make plenty of things, not just out of the metal, but also out of the mostly out of the explosive. And a big bomb, so on the Vietnamese market, maybe 10-20 years ago, would amount to like $100. And I mean, it's only a small fraction of the cost of the bomb, but for poor people in those areas, that's a huge amount of money. But because of that, kids have to learn growing up that, well, these are bombs and these are not toys. And if you think about it, some of the bombs, like those cluster bombs, like they're extremely dangerous precisely because like they could get anywhere and they look like toys. And despite all that, the markets, the market for explosives and shells here is quite active, and that is the part that I think poses creates a lot of accidents, and that sort of creates a lot of economic uncertainty in those areas with a lot of UXOs. So I couldn't get any news from news piece from Laos. I don't read Laotian, so this is something that I get from like just randomly, and it's still in 2018. So not so far away. There's an article in on like a Vietnamese newspaper saying that there's a family that was sawing. So literally, like they just saw the bomb until they could get the explosive out. But sawing means that it gets hot, right? And if the explosive gets hot, the whole thing explodes. So this family succeeded in sawing the first 4 bombs. The 5th bomb exploded and 1 person died. But this is still quite common in central Vietnam, and I guess that it is the case in Laos as well. And this would happen especially in areas with low and unstable income and low education. And I think that could well be part of this vicious cycle that perpetuates the conflict trap. It's precisely if, in areas that are poor, they would get into the trap this way, and it's extremely dangerous, and it creates a lot of uncertainty in many ways. Okay, so I would not go through those very interesting. So I think the paper has done an excellent job in terms of really a thorough collection of many data sets that I will not go through. And the empirical strategy is really sound, and I buy the results. I think they are really, really clearly causal. So now I want to get to the comparison with Miguel and Roland. Felipe has talked a little bit about it. So they found no cross-sectional effects of bombing, but what's perhaps more important is that they found they did not show any results on different cohorts who were more or less exposed to bombing. And this is what this paper about Laos shows very convincingly. And if I remember, so I attended Gerard's talk when he gave this talk at MIT. There's like 2005 or something. So I made this point exactly about looking at the differential effects using the Vietnam Household Living Standard Survey, but unfortunately so the suggestion did not make it to the final version of the paper. Now, some other points that are quite different that I think highlights the differences between the case of Vietnam and the case of Laos. So post-war government intervention in Vietnam was huge, and I don't know enough about Laos. I don't think it was as much pervasive and extensive. So there's a lot of destruction of productive capacity. Well, actually, it took place even before 1975, and after 1975, the young military men from the north would not know anything about like operating tractors and they simply just destroyed those things sort of in a random way. There was a lot of strong campaign of collectivization and restructuring of the economy in South Vietnam. Basically, it was a way to confiscate productive assets from asset owners, and in the end, it really destroyed private ownership and all the economy. And so that's another force that could balance out, bombed versus more or less bombed areas in Vietnam. There was the huge exodus of people, well, in Laos as well, but in Vietnam, it's like people with industrial productive knowledge, and especially in the early 1980s. Well, many of them ended up in Hong Kong, or at least passing through Hong Kong. The rich are more likely to leave. So all that created this balancing forces that are not really the same economic geography forces that people talk about in Japan or Germany. This is just a very specific Vietnamese context. And the last one I think is really the most important one, especially for this paper on Vietnam, is that there's a massive immigration, partly forced by the central government in Vietnam, and especially to the Central Highland and the southeastern provinces in south of Vietnam. So these are the areas that were also the most heavily bombed, because they basically traced the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they were moved there for various reasons. One reason that people flocked to the Central Highland was that they went on to create like the second largest coffee exporters in the world. Sorry, Felipe, for taking that position from Colombia. But so for various reasons, they basically changed the whole geography, and that's why that paper could not see. I think it constitutes a big reason why that paper could not see any cross-sectional effect. And I don't think it was really the reason behind. Well, it was not the economic geography reason behind, with market forces that we see in Germany and Japan. So in that sense, finding those strong effects in Laos is really novel in terms of understanding the consequences of war, especially when there's not that much governmental interventions.
Okay, QA, so we have to speed up. So maybe try to finish the discussion in 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. So I have some more comments. I think it's better that I send them directly to the authors. So the well, there could be a bit of selective migration, but again, so one more thing that I'd like to ask. So this is a small control variable, but I think the trail was mostly jungle covered. So if you could get any measure of jungle coverage from before the war, and I think there was some measure like that. So again, this is a comment that I also made to during Gerard Roland's talk. Then it could be useful. Now you have control for the 1960 population density, and I think that's a huge step, because that covers quite a bit of that. But going a bit further to control for jungle coverage, I think that could really take out some of that. And after all, well, there was a lot of deforestation, but the jungle, so places that are still in jungle now, obviously they tend to have lower nighttime luminosity. So another thing one last thing I want to talk about is the mechanism we think of as transition from agriculture to service. So can we think of that as channel, or maybe it can also be a consequence, and so all that can just be like a vicious circle that we see here. So in a sense, if we look at this map, then UXOs directly, of course, they directly affect agricultural production. Like it's a lot harder to do agricultural work, to cultivate on this kind of land. So despite that, we see more agricultural activities, and I wonder if this is a kind of like the income effect, a bit like in the case of the Irish famine that made people consume more potatoes. So maybe here the income effect is so strong that it pushes people even further into agriculture and much less to service, just because that's the only way they could sustain the minimum like living standards. So that's one thing that I have in mind. Some less important comments on the IVs. I think like I trust the IV. There's just some more thoughts to think about. So to conclude, I think the paper works on something that's really important. Conflicts are ubiquitous. We see many of them. It's just in Ukraine, but like many other places now. And what the paper also highlights is that conflicts are multidimensional. So one aspect of this big conflicts that get talked so much about is like the bombing. And it's not just bombing; it's bombing in Laos. And if you focus on that, you see that like the effects and the importance of it, through a totally different angle. And those are things that could perpetuate not just on like physical aspects that we could measure, but sometimes on psychological aspects as well. So I'm thinking of like Wendrila Dubé's paper on the conflict in Sierra Leone, where psychological wounds last for a long time. So it's really important to understand those long-term impacts so that we could make better policy. So again, I think this paper is really a milestone in terms of pushing the whole literature, the whole field forward. Thank you so much, and sorry for running over time.
Okay, many thanks, QA. So Felipe, you can do some quick responses, better within 3 minutes.
Okay, so I mean, in 3 minutes, let me just thank QA for a very careful reading of the paper. I think you've nailed it. I mean, I think you talked about big issues, the conflict trap, the big push at the end of like this idea that you're further into poverty. And I think a conversation that even though this is a history paper, maybe we want to start, especially nowadays, about policy and about demining. I mean, of course, we're not activists, but I think that we add to the debate with serious research about an important topic. So I very much embrace that. I take the disaggregation point. I mean, I think that this is almost a limit of the type of econometric analysis that we do, that is more individual than like bigger picture. I mean, maybe we do across country to look at some of these other issues. I second the fact that yes, there's an industry of that. I just went to like take what I bought in Laos, that they sell these shrapnels from the bombs, extremely dangerous, and this is, I don't know, $5, $10, and then you can die in the process. And then I very much take all of the points of the Miguel and Roland, which are going to help us to draft that. I think there was stuff on the chat. Let me just in 1 minute say thanks, David Mitch. Yes, I mean, we can look a bit more about like spillovers and stuff too. Is it just diversion or is it generally poorer? It relates back to QS point of like this is disaggregated, but it's not national. Wanda Wang has had something on maybe rebellion in modern times. We can look at that. Xin Hao was suggesting some paper that seems to be consistent with the story of education. Happy to look at that. Thank you so much for the reference. Thank you, everyone. And maybe JF, I don't know if you want to like add something, some final remarks.
No, probably just thank you for the opportunity of presenting our work here and for all the great comments. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you both. So yeah, we still have a couple of questions from maybe our students, and later we will forward all the questions in the QA box to Felipe and Joanne for their consideration. So finally, Professor Chen, do you anything?
Just well, first of all, yeah, thank you, Philip and the QA for the wonderful presentation and discussion. Just very quickly, Philip, I was thinking, there is a large literature after Jared Diamond's work and then Peter Turkin's work, where they show that wars or the threat of wars tends to make societies more organized, and then leading to earlier and more serious state formation efforts to establish better defense and better law and order, so that their state capacity would actually improve. So there, they would establish a somewhat more positive long-term impact of wars, because once their state formation is done better, then they can have stronger state capacity and then better development later on. But I guess in their case, they have looked at the last few thousand years of war threats and their impacts. So I would say that was mostly before the firearms led military revolution. But of course, in your case, I mean, this extent of serious bombing, I mean, that probably has caused a very different long-term effect than the more traditional old weapons, non-firearms based war and battles. So how do you think, what may explain the difference in what they find and what you find using this case of Laos?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another like huge picture question, which like opens like a whole debate. I think one main difference here, which I mean, we can think about the external validity or not of this context, is when is war endogenous and when is war exogenous. In the context of European state building, there's a lot of endogeneity. France goes to war with Germany, Germany goes to war with England, etc., and they do this for hundreds of years. But you have kind of like all of the things that lead to war. So especially this idea that you're building a fiscal capacity. It's also there in the work that you're mentioning and the work of about war and cooperation. Maybe we cooperate more with each other, and then we go to war, and then we go to war, and then we cooperate more with each other. I think it's a little bit different if it's a Cold War type of war, where, yeah, I mean, like the inner Cambodian and the inner Laotian conflict was there. I mean, there was an existing civil war, but it would honestly have not amounted to the massive deaths if it weren't for, in this case, external interventions. So I think that there, I mean, it's not like one side has the state capacity to like now go bomb the other side. It's just some other superpower that is bombing this area. So I think that there's, I mean, it's interesting because maybe there's a lot that we don't see because it's not an endogenous war on the negative, but there's also a lot that we're not going to see on the potential positive effects of the war, that people are, I don't know, more nationalistic or they pay taxes more. We just don't see this because this is quote unquote literally like falling from the sky. So I very much embrace the spirit of the question, but I think that there's some fundamental differences about some types of conflict versus others. And this is a bit closer to what like QA was saying of like, oh, this is closer to Cold War, and within the Cold War this happened, and but there's like these other external powers that are driving a lot of the action.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So Chichen, go back to you.
Well,
Yes,
so yeah, thanks. I think time's up. Thank you again, Felipe and QA, for the wonderful talk, and congratulations on this great work. Finally, our next event is scheduled on May 26th, when Professor Joy Chen from Chang Kang Graduate School of Business from Beijing will give us a talk about state building in the very ancient China. We look forward to see you again. Okay, thank you again. Bye.
All right, thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.